It was 1945. Japan was burning. Cities had turned to ash, and an empire built on conquest was collapsing. But deep in the Philippine jungles, far from Tokyo, far from the surrender that would soon change history, one man still fought a war that no longer existed. His name was Hiroo Onoda, a lieutenant in the Imperial Japanese Army, trained in intelligence, survival, and guerrilla warfare. He was a man molded by loyalty, discipline, and one unbreakable order. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. You will continue to fight until the Imperial Army returns to relieve you. Those were the last words his commanding officer spoke to him before he disappeared into the dense green jungle of Lubang Island in December 1944. Onoda's mission was simple in command, but impossible in reality. Sabotage enemy positions, gather intelligence, and never, under any circumstance, surrender. But the world was changing faster than he could imagine. By mid-1945, Japan had fallen. The war was over, but no one told Hiroo Onoda. When Allied troops landed on Lubang, Onoda and his small team retreated deeper into the forest. They believed the war had merely shifted, that Japan's silence meant regrouping, not defeat. The soldiers built huts from bamboo, hunted wild animals, and raided local farms for rice. They patched their uniforms with vines, sharpened their bayonets with stones, and waited for orders that would never come. At night, they listened for planes, Japanese planes, to drop the message that the empire still lived. But only American bombers crossed the sky. And so Onoda kept fighting. Every sound in the forest was the enemy. Every village light in the distance was a trap. Every whisper of peace was a lie. Leaflets began to fall from the air, messages from the Allies declaring that the war had ended, but to Onoda, they were enemy propaganda. He burned them without reading a word. To him, the idea of surrender was worse than death, because in his mind, Japan could not fall, not truly, and if his emperor still stood, then so would he. Days turned into months, months turned into years, and years into decades. Hiroo Onoda had vanished into the jungle, and soon the world would forget he even existed. But he never forgot his mission, because for him, the war would never end. The world moved on, nations rebuilt, but in one forgotten jungle, a soldier kept fighting for a country that no longer existed. For most of the world, 1946 was the year peace returned, but for Hiroo Onoda, it was just another year of war. He was not alone. 3 men remained by his side: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. 4 soldiers, stranded, hungry, but unbroken, carrying out a war that only existed in their minds. They built camps deep inside Lubang's dense jungle, where the sun barely touched the ground. They learned to move like shadows, never leaving a footprint that could betray them. They hunted cows and stole rice from farmers at night, believing every civilian was an American spy. When the villagers pleaded with them to surrender, they thought it was a trick. When planes dropped leaflets declaring the war ended in August 1945, Japan has surrendered, they examined them under candlelight, convinced the English was forged and the Japanese translation faked. To them, this was psychological warfare, the enemy trying to break their loyalty. And so the small group continued to fight invisible battles. They ambushed patrols, exchanged gunfire with local police, and disappeared again into the green fog of the forest. Every gunshot echoed through the jungle like a ghost from a forgotten war. But time is an enemy no soldier can defeat. One by one, Onoda's comrades began to fade. In 1949, Private Akatsu could take no more. Starvation, mosquitoes, fear. It became unbearable. He slipped away one night and surrendered to the Philippine authorities. When Onoda heard the news, he felt a cold rage. To him, Akatsu wasn't a survivor. He was a traitor. Yet, even as the group shrank, Onoda's conviction grew harder, sharper, more unyielding. He believed the Japanese army would return any day now, marching in from the beaches to liberate him. Years passed, then decades. By 1952, the Japanese government had officially declared all missing soldiers dead. But Onoda's family refused to believe it. They sent search parties. They dropped new letters from the sky. Even Onoda's own brother came to Lubang and shouted through megaphones, "Hiroo, the war is over, come home!" But Onoda never answered. He stayed hidden, silent, watching. To him, the voice of his brother could only mean one thing. The Americans had captured him and were using him as bait. And so he stayed in the jungle, obeying the final order that had become his purpose. Never surrender. Never take your life. Continue to fight. By 1959, Onoda and Kozuka were the last ones left. The world had forgotten them, the islanders feared them, and the war, the real war, was now a ghost that haunted only two men. In the heart of a forgotten jungle, two soldiers lived as shadows, loyal to a war that time itself had abandoned. "Hiroo, the war is over, come home!" But Onoda never answered. He stayed hidden, silent, watching. To him, the voice of his brother could only mean one thing. The Americans had captured him and were using him as bait. And so he stayed in the jungle, obeying the final order that had become his purpose. Never surrender. Never take your life. Continue to fight. By 1959, Onoda and Kozuka were the last ones left. The world had forgotten them, the islanders feared them, and the war, the real war, was now a ghost that haunted only two men. In the heart of a forgotten jungle, two soldiers lived as shadows, loyal to a war that time itself had abandoned. By the 1960s, the world had moved on. New wars had begun. Men had walked on the moon. And Japan, the empire Onoda had once sworn to protect, was now a thriving, modern nation of peace. But, deep in the jungles of Lubang Island, one man still lived in 1945. He polished his rifle, inspected his rounds, and watched the skies for orders that would never come. He was Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, the last soldier of an empire that no longer existed. Only one comrade remained with him, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. Together they hunted by night, repaired their uniforms by hand, and spoke of the day Japan would return. They were no longer soldiers. They were phantoms. Each year, the jungle claimed another piece of them. Their boots, their strength, their sanity. But their loyalty never wavered. Then, one day in October 1972, it all ended. While burning a local farmer's rice supply, part of what they still believed was a mission of sabotage, the Philippine police spotted them. A short exchange of gunfire followed. When the smoke cleared, Kozuka lay dead. He had served beside Onoda for nearly 30 years. Now Onoda was completely alone. The Philippine government recovered Kozuka's body, shocking the world. Japan was stunned. The soldier from World War II, still fighting. Newspapers called Onoda the ghost of the jungle. Expeditions were launched. Search teams dropped photos, leaflets, and even recordings from Onoda's family. But the man they were trying to reach had long stopped believing in the world beyond the trees. To him, everything outside his mission was the enemy's trick. He hid deeper, retreating into his mind and his orders. Rain, fever, loneliness, nothing could break him. He would die before surrendering to propaganda. Then, in 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki stepped onto Lubang Island. He wasn't a soldier or a government agent. He was just a traveller, searching, as he put it, for Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. People laughed at him. But Suzuki wasn't joking. He wanted to find the man who refused to surrender and bring him home. After days of searching through dense jungle and forgotten trails, Suzuki found him. A figure stepped out from the shadows wearing a tattered uniform, rifle in hand, eyes sharp and cautious. It was Hiroo Onoda. Suzuki raised his hands and spoke in Japanese. "Onoda-san, the war is over. It ended decades ago." Onoda stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then he shook his head. "The war will end when my commanding officer orders me to stop. Until then, I am a soldier of the Emperor." For Onoda, the jungle wasn't a prison, it was duty, and even after 29 years he would not break his command. Suzuki bowed and said quietly, "Then I will find your commander." The world had changed beyond recognition, but one man's war, one man's belief still burned untouched by time. It was March 1974. Almost 30 years after the end of World War II. Hiroo Onoda was 52 years old. His uniform was in tatters, his rifle still oiled and ready, and his eyes still searching for a war that the world had long buried. True to his word, Norio Suzuki returned to Japan and tracked down Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer, the very man who had given him his final orders in 1944. Taniguchi had retired from the army decades earlier. He worked quietly in a bookstore now, trying to forget the war. When Suzuki told him that one of his soldiers was still fighting, still obeying his command, Taniguchi was speechless. The war that had haunted his generation was about to summon him back, one last time. A few weeks later, Major Taniguchi landed on Lubang Island. He was in his 60s now, wearing a civilian suit and carrying a faded imperial flag. The Philippine government, curious and cautious, allowed the meeting to happen. Onoda waited in the jungle, his rifle still by his side. When he saw his commanding officer, he snapped to attention. His body thin, his uniform frayed, but his salute perfect. When he saw his commanding officer, he snapped to attention. His body thin, his uniform frayed, but his salute perfect. For 30 years he had obeyed the words of this man. And now at last those words came again. "Lieutenant Onoda," Taniguchi said, reading from an official document, "the Imperial Japanese Army Command has ceased all combat activity. The war ended on August 15th, 1945. You are hereby relieved of your duties." For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Hiroo Onoda lowered his weapon. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I am sorry it took me so long." He then handed over his rifle, still in working condition, along with 500 rounds of ammunition, a sword, and grenades he had carried since 1944. The next day, Onoda emerged from the jungle in full uniform. He stood straight and proud as he saluted the Philippine soldiers who had once hunted him. He surrendered not in defeat, but in dignity. When reporters swarmed him, he said simply, "I was carrying out my orders. Nothing less, nothing more." The world was stunned. Japan welcomed him home as a hero, a man who embodied loyalty and duty beyond comprehension. But to Onoda, it was not heroism. It was confusion. Tokyo was unrecognizable. Neon lights, cars and skyscrapers, the empire he fought for no longer existed. He once said, "I felt like I had returned to a foreign country." Haunted by the years he had lost, Onoda moved to Brazil, where he raised cattle and lived quietly. Years later, he returned to Japan to teach young people about resilience, but also the dangers of blind obedience. In 2014, Hiroo Onoda passed away at the age of 91. His funeral was attended by thousands. But perhaps the most haunting tribute came from his old friend, Norio Suzuki, who once said before his own death, "Onoda was not crazy. He was loyal to a world that no longer existed." For nearly 30 years, one man waged a war that ended without him. And when he finally laid down his rifle, the world was left asking, was he a fool or the last true soldier?